Welcome everyone to Mask Up, our current session in the pandemic perspectives. The National Museum is very delighted to host everyone. And normally, of course, we would like to be at the museum and have people come, but because of the pandemic, the museum itself is closed. And in fact, this week, there's a giant fence all around the museum because the entire mall area is the green zone and no one can get in. So luckily, through the beauties of Zoom, we're able to talk to you wherever you might be. We'd really like this to be interactive and have a chance to answer your questions. So if you do have questions as we move along, please use the Q&A function, not the chat, but the Q&A function, and send us a question and we'll try to answer it for you. This session is part of our ongoing Tuesday Colloquium series, and we have many panelists here today to give us interesting insights on objects out of our collections. We're also very thankful for the Smithsonian affiliates for their help with this program. There are 214 museums and educational institutions in the affiliation programs in 48 states, Panama and Puerto Rico. And one of our panelists, Clara Berg, is from the Museum of History and Industry in Seattle. Here you can see it on the screen, a really wonderful place. I recommend everybody go to it whenever possible. Our panelists today are Clara Berg, Michelle McCollum, and Alexandria Lord. Clara Berg is the curator of collections at the Museum of History and Industry in Seattle. In 2020, two of her major projects were collecting artifacts and stories from the pandemic and working on a plan to diversify the museum's collection. Really challenging work to be collecting during such difficult times. Berg is a graduate of the Fashion and Textile Studies program, the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. In 2019, she curated the Museum of History and Industry's exhibition, Seattle Style Fashion Function. Michelle McCollum, his PhD is the Joanna Meyer Magoon Principal Archivist at the Bentley Historic Library at the University of Michigan, an American historian focusing especially on gender, medicine, and intersections of place and story. McCollum has worked in academia, museums, and historic preservation over the course of her career. She is the author of, this is really a wonderful book, she is the author of Lady Lushes, Gender, Alcoholism, and Medicine in Modern America. She is currently working on a book-length study of heritage tourism at sites associated with the Little House books by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Our last panelist is Alexandria Lord. She is the chair of Medicine and Science Division at the National Museum of American History and a curator of the history of medicine. She received her AB from Vassar and her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In 2010, the British Medical Association awarded her book, Condemnation, the US government sex education campaign for World War I to the internet, its prize for the best popular book on medicine. She has spoken on historical topics in venues ranging from the History Channel to academic conferences, Ellis Island, and Planned Parenthood. So thank you, panelists, for joining us. I think this will be a fascinating session sparked by objects mostly from the Smithsonian collections, but also from the panelist collections. So we'll see a lot of different things. In terms of thinking about the history of masks, industrial safety is really the place to start. So we're going to look a bit at industrial safety. The beginnings of masks go back to very early times, 1st century AD with Pliny the Elder, looking at potential respiratory issues. But it really isn't until fairly modern times that masks and respirators become really important. I wonder if Lexi, you might speak a little bit to this notion of when medicine starts to intervene in terms of medical wear.
Sure. If we're starting to think about sort of wearing masks, if you want to maybe flip to the next sort of slides, Peter, and we move to look at medicine. Uh, people tend to think of the plague and in 1348, and they always think of that sort of typical mask that is associated with the plague doctor. But that's not really from the Middle Ages. In fact, that's something from the 17th century associated with a French physician. And of course, the ideas behind that and the use of the mask during that period were quite different from our ideas today. At that time, there are multiple theories about what might cause disease, but one of them was this idea of bad air. And so the mask, obviously, if you was often filled with different herbs to prevent sort of that inhalation of the bad air. But again, this is something that's very, very rare. We tend to see this image, it's wildly popular, but it is not a medieval image, and it is not something that was common in the 17th century either. It's not really until a little bit later, if you want to flip, Peter.
Well, let me interrupt you. I really want to go back to you're getting ahead of us a little bit. If we
Sure.
can really think about the industrial applications. We've got the notion before medicine really, I guess, became dominant. We did have some non-medical use of air. They're worried about materials in lungs. Do any of you have any comments about either firefighting, mining, or in wartime use for the need for masks?
Yeah, I would just jump in, and maybe Clara and Michelle want to come too, is that there certainly was an awareness that some occupations stirred up dust, and there was an early attempt to really protect against that dust, sometimes with a wet cloth or sometimes just with a cloth itself. So you can go back even further from this, but that idea that certain occupations presented exposure to dangerous dusts or particles. That was fairly common, fairly early on acknowledged.
Now, I assume that particulate is a question in the lungs. What is it that what's the mechanism? The lungs don't, I assume, don't like dust and particles. What is really going on from a medical perspective there?
You mean sort of like, I'm not sure, sorry, what you're asking, Peter, and you mean sort of like what's happening to the lungs? You're getting an irritant in the lungs, which is obviously causing all sorts of responses, coughing. It might also contribute to disease. And certainly by the early 20th century, you had industrial hygienists like Alice Hamilton beginning to think about the dangers that this kind of dust was creating for workers.
And I think I
think the Bureau of Mines really sets a lot of the standards. They're formed and push the standardization forward. Well, let's move on to N95s. We've heard a lot about N95s. What's the difference between a dust mask and an N95 mask?
So do you want me to?
Sure, anybody, if any of you can leap in here.
Sure. So the N95 mask is actually using a specific technique to create a much denser protection than the dust mask would have created in the 1960s, so that it's a better form of protection for the wearer.
And here in the photograph, you can see the the two cupped N95 masks. One is covered with, is the medical grade, which is covered with material that fends off body fluids, but the material that's stopping the particles themselves is really the same in those two. Well, now we'll move on to the medical practice. Lexi, you told us a little bit about that early period, but germ theory is something that certainly comes into being important in terms of wearing of masks. Michelle, is that what's the difference between masks that stop germs and masks that stop dust?
Well, in a way, there's not that much difference in the sense that it's a barrier, it's some kind of barrier protecting the person's body, right? So I think one of the things that's really interesting about those industrial examples too is that the danger is something in the environment. And if you're trying to protect against a microbe, then the danger could be coming just from another person. And I think that is quite a difference in what we think we're protecting against. But I think so these images from like 1915 and the late 19th and early 20th century, this is when ideas of the germ theory are starting to get traction, but they're not quickly or universally accepted. And Lexi referred earlier to the idea of bad air, that the things that make you sick are just somehow floating around, that they use the term miasma, or believe that it was literally coming from dirt or from piles of manure or waste or things like that. So I mean, I think it's different to say it's a particular microbe that needs to be protected against with a greater degree of the mask has to be more powerful to be able to prevent the passage of something so small, is how we might think of it today. But the sense that there's some kind of barrier that's augmenting my own protection in the world, I think is a kind of a common denominator here. And I think this also shows, I mean, you see the physician there with his nose showing that, like, it's not like people flipped a switch and completely got it or completely accepted that this was going to work. Then as now, these things were controversial and not universally accepted right off the bat.
Yeah, the image, that's actually William Mayo of the Mayo Clinic in that image. So you can see that it's a very elite physician, and he still is using sort of what we would consider a mask that has a limited ability to protect. It's not really until the 1890s that physicians began to think about using a mask to protect, and understanding that the physician himself or herself, there were women physicians then, could actually infect the patient. And that was especially true, obviously, during surgery when the body is open. So you can see that it's, as Michelle was saying, it's sort of a progression, really, in terms of wearing the mask.
Hand washing too, there was a lot of resistance, including by some physicians, that it was very difficult for many of them to believe that they are the healers, that they could be the ones that were transmitting disease from one patient to another or from themselves to a patient. So yeah.
And even that mask, you know, we see it sort of pulled up under the nose, but even that mask itself, the fabric is undergoing sort of a constant change and shift too. They start out by using one layer of gauze, and then they start advocating for 2 layers of gauze. So it's a transition in a lot of ways. It's not like everyone sort of wakes up at one date and says, aha, we should wear a mask. It should be multiple layers. It should cover the nose. It should cover the mouth. This is really a slow progress. And really into the 20th century, well into the 20th century, you have, as Michelle said, physicians really questioning this.
So we have a question from the audience, a medical question. Hasn't the inhalation of pesticides resulted in blood crises, such as leukemia, et cetera? What about nuclear waste in the air? Can you filter it with a mask? I think I know the answer to the last part, but I'll lean towards you all.
Go for it, Peter.
I'm betting that masks don't hold a candle to nuclear waste. But I think the pesticide part of it is probably, well, I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are.
I don't know the science, but I guess what I would emphasize is kind of what I said before, that this moment that we're living in right now, for me at least, this is the first time I've worn a mask in everyday life. And so it feels very exceptional, but I think it points to this kind of ongoing awareness, I guess, of the interaction between the individual and the environment when it comes to health. And so that question even being raised, I think just again speaks to that, like how if there are risks out there to my bodily integrity or bodily health, how can I protect against that?
Great. Well, let's move on to some really famous masks. Dating to the 1918-1919 pandemic. Clara, can you say a little bit about the mask in the bottom right corner? That mask is from your collection.
Sure. Yeah, at MoHi, we have a couple different influenza masks from the 1918-1919 period. I didn't know until this last year that a lot of museums don't have, it's not as common to find masks in the collection. I think it's because there were more West Coast cities had mask mandates. So Seattle was a city that had a requirement to wear masks. The requirement was that, or the recommendation was, a 6-ply cotton gauze. And I'm not sure if our masks comply with that, but they seem pretty thin to me. They're definitely more porous than what we're wearing today. I think you could blow out a candle while wearing this mask. But even then, there was a lot of resistance to mask wearing. There were arrests related to mask wearing. And they also, one of the things that cities did who had the mandates was trying to use some of the language around draft dodging for mask. So they called it people who are mask slackers or mask scoffers, to try to create a stigma around people who didn't want to wear masks, and sort of try to tie it to kind of a war effort idea, or an idea of like doing your duty by wearing masks. But there was resistance. There were people who didn't like them. People didn't think they were comfortable. They were hard to breathe in. A lot of the comments we hear today. It's a little debatable exactly how effective they were, because as I said, the gauze is not as thick as a lot of the materials that we have today for masks. But I think in general, a lot of the West Coast cities did sort of flatten the curve better than other parts of the country. It's hard to know if exactly that was because of the mask mandates, but that was something that places like Seattle tried, and we did have a lower toll, I think, than other cities of similar sizes.
Wow, 3 masks in your collection is pretty impressive. I think that I don't believe there are any 1918 masks in the Smithsonian collections. So we're very envious of you. Michelle, can you tell us a bit about this fascinating scrapbook page with a mask on it? What's actually, it looks like a mini story in itself.
Right. So we have at the Bentley Historical Library, which is the archives of the University of Michigan, as well as documenting the history of the state of Michigan. This is a page from a scrapbook. So student scrapbooks were all the rage in the early 20th century. We have a nice collection of those. And this student named Alfred Wilkinson kept the mask. And like Clara said, on campus at the university at that time, there was a mask mandate also. Faculty and students had to wear them. And Wilkinson collected, as you can see on that page, several different things, including the directions for how to use them and clean them, which is what's in the upper right-hand corner. And it's really useful to have that as well as the mask itself. You were supposed to wash it every other night in hot, sudsy water, and then rinse it in hot water and wear it at all times, except when you were eating. And you can see too, I think that it's both kind of just spatially how he arranged this. He's got his report card. He's got a little newspaper article. Like this was just part of this. This suggests this was really part of his student experience, right? I mean, it was this extraordinary thing that happened, but he's sort of embedding it in the rest of his life in the way that he put it on the page. And the mask survived because he donated his scrapbook to the University of Michigan, right? He decided to keep the mask, and there's some indication that they were supposed to give them back, but he did not. And of course, we're glad that he didn't, but put it in the scrapbook and then gave the whole scrapbook. So it's kind of an accident in a sense that mask survived as well. Or serendipity, I guess is maybe better to say.
Lexi, on the upper right corner and the lower left corner, you can see ambulance corps and some of this information about masks. In 1918, can you sort of set the scene for why people started wearing masks, and was it really effective or not?
Sure. It obviously depends on the mask itself. As Clara was saying, some of these masks are quite thin and therefore would not have been as effective. Other masks, might be more effective. It really depends on the mask. And it also, as we've all seen today, it depends on how you wear it too. So if you're wearing it like William Mayo in that photograph that we had, then it's not going to be as effective. But it's really sort of in many ways, 1918 is a sort of turning point with, I would say, more the general public really recognizing that masks were or could be an effective tool. You start to see widespread use of them. They'd really begun to be accepted by some leading sort of more prominent physicians about 1910, and 1918 is when they really become fairly more common. And you can see them wearing the masks here. And as Clara said, and as Michelle said, many places did have mask mandates. And as they both said, those mask mandates were also contentious in different communities. People saw them as, just as they do today, an infringement on their civil liberties. There was also a belief that they were damaging to the economy. People didn't want to go to stores where people were wearing masks. My personal favorite is that the tobacco stores were most heavily up in arms because, of course, if you're wearing a mask, you can't smoke. So they thought this was really bad for business. So you can see that tension against the masks, the pushback coming in 1918, just as it does today.
But I would just,
yes,
if I could just add to that, I think one thing about 1918 and 1919, and Clara spoke to this as well, right? So especially in 1918, the United States is literally fighting a war. So some of the imperatives to fight the war are in direct contrast to what you're trying to do to fight this disease. You don't want to bring people together. You don't want to kind of speed things up. If you're trying to control, as we say now, flatten the curve. But at that time, to fight or to sell war bonds or to, build munitions or whatever, that's exactly what you had to do. But as Clara said, I think rhetorically, there was a way in 1918 that the fact that the United States was in a war that sort of allowed that, leveraging that same kind of discussion about, like, this isn't just about you. So even what I was saying previously about, it's a barrier to protect my body. Now, because it's a contagious disease and the threat is other people, if you're wearing a mask, you're doing that as an act of public good. You're doing that for other people. And that, I think, is a shift compared to at least some of the industrial ones that we were talking about before. It's a different, the act has a different meaning now as well.
And just to build too on what Michelle was saying about war, what's interesting too is that a lot of women, obviously during war, during World War I, just as they'd done during other wars, that business of rolling bandages, knitting socks, knitting scarves and mittens for the boys in the trenches, those groups just gravitate right to making masks. So it's actually an interesting thing, because if you look about today, there was sort of like a little bit of a gearing up, and then you do see the emergence of these sort of sewing groups and community groups that make masks en masse for their community. But those groups were already sort of formed when the influenza pandemics started to really hit and mask mandates came down.
Was the notion of the mask at all political in 1918 and 1919 as it has become today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always political. I mean, public health is always political in many ways because it does require a group to make a decision to do certain things or to endorse certain ideas. And so there's always a political component, but you can definitely see that in San Francisco. There were really contentious city council meetings about the mask wearing, similar to, what we're seeing today with sort of people storming the city council meeting and protesting about this. So yes, it was highly politicized in many ways.
Fascinating. Moving on, really curious, in the period after the 1918-1919 pandemic, and 100 years until the next big pandemic, did people really become lax, or was there continued use of masks? What is the experience like?
I would say it goes back and forth. You definitely see a greater understanding among the general public. Now you have basically most Americans have accepted the idea of germ theory, so they understand how and why a mask might work. And there are concerns about protecting against infection. But ironically, you also still have complaints. You can read them in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, from the 50s and 60s, people complaining that physicians are pretty careless with wearing masks, and surgeons as well. It's hard to say that there's like a universal acceptance and a universal adoption of mask wearing. It's like anything, it kind of staggers along, and there's pushback and lapses.
And I think I would add to that, and Lexi, I'd be curious to hear if you have more to say on this, but like, it's no accident, I don't think, that this one is about protecting a baby, right? Or, you would expect a surgeon to wear one, or hope that a surgeon would wear one, but there's something about the person who the person's vulnerable in a way. That's why you're wearing a mask. So the idea that I think they would be part of everyday life would sit oddly with the successes of scientific medicine in the mid to late 20th century, because by then we had antibiotics, right? So even if you've accepted now germ theory, you don't need this, because you've got this magic bullet of other things that will cure disease at the back end, kind of. And if anything, I could see these feeling maybe not modern enough, or not an appropriate intervention at kind of a broad scale once you have antibiotics, and most or many infectious diseases seem like they were under control through vaccination or other kinds of public health measures.
Yeah, definitely agree.
Fascinating. So the nature of modernity made masks seem old-fashioned and not necessary?
I'm just making that up kind of as I go, but that all kind of came together looking at this one in particular about the baby. So maybe Lexi disagrees, I don't know, but that's sort of what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is something to that. I mean, certainly there's you don't see the general public wearing it. Right before we came on, we were discussing the idea of would we wear masks after COVID-19? Will we wear them to protect ourselves against things like, the common cold or the flu if we were worried about getting on public transportation? And I don't think that idea was really around in the 50s or 60s. But what's interesting is, though, that the idea that the mask becomes associated with the physician really strongly during this period. I mean, this is the period where you see all these, I would almost call them glamour shots. Historians talk about the 50s and 60s as the golden age of the physician. And you see these glamour shots of physicians, and you see them, they're dressed in a specific way, and you see them with the mask. That has become an element of the physician's uniform clothing, and it's always a he, although there are women physicians at this time, but those glamour shots are always of the male physician wearing a mask.
That's absolutely fascinating. I'm going to move us on to our next section, mask production, and just want to remind you in the audience, if you have thoughts, if you want to jump in, take us down some different paths, feel free to type a question into the Q&A function, and we'll try to answer it. While the regular folks can't make a N95 mask, a really high-tech mask, sewing is something that a lot of people can do on a commercial level and an individual level. So we'd like to look at mass production. And the first thing we'd like to do is actually take a poll and see what your experience has been. I think we're going to get a little pop-up window here, and you can tell us whether you made a mask and it was successful, whether you tried but it failed, whether you wanted to but never got around to it, or no, you didn't make a mask at all. We'll give this another few seconds. Looks like very, I have to say, I'm shocked that very few failures in here, that most people seem to, that wanted to were successful. I'm impressed. Personally, I was in that last category of, I did not try to make a mask because making it with Scotch tape really didn't seem like an effective technique. All right, so we're going to share our results here. You can see 30% of you did try and it was successful. Only 4% failed. 16% of you tried to, but never got around to it, and 55 did not try to make a mask. So here we can see a little bit of the volunteerism. On your left, you can see the supplies from one of my peers who thought it would be great to make masks, and got material and got elastic. Elastic was very difficult to find, but never quite got around to sewing it. On the right is an interesting story of volunteerism. Very early, I think it was in March of this year, some of the Mary Rose Jimenez in Del Rio, Texas, realized that her friends and associates needed masks, and they actually, she worked at Walmart. She cut up some of the vests and used the material to hand sew masks for each other. Panel, I wonder if any of you have stories about volunteer efforts to make masks. Was this a common kind of phenomena? In our poll, it looked as though a fair number of people did try to make masks themselves.
Yeah, I think there was, kind of remember that there was kind of two phases of the mask making, because initially there was such a lack of PPE that, and actually people were discouraged from wearing masks. So everything was supposed to go to the medical workers. And so I think there was, at least in Seattle, there was a first phase where every company that had access to sewing machines, so we had like Eddie Bauer and Outdoor Research, which are outdoor gear companies, and then the Seattle Opera, which has an incredible workshop of creating masks and then donating them to local hospitals and making sure that people were supplied. But then there was kind of a later phase when when the need in hospitals was a little less dire, but then, every regular person needed a mask too. And, I tried the bandana technique at first, and it was terrible. And it was like, all right, I'm going to buy a mask from somebody who could sew. And so then I think there were a lot of small designers too that were donating masks as well, but then it became kind of this big effort that everyone needs a mask.
Yeah, we noticed the same in the museum, that there were also sort of like a movement of corporations and companies trying to make masks, but also individuals and groups. We were really struck by a lot of community groups that we've seen evidence that came together, whether it's just, you know, my book club got together and decided to make masks together, or our church decided to make masks. So we were starting to hear from different people across the country about the different groups to which they belonged, which were making masks. And as Clara said, they started by making them usually for medical practitioners, and then moving to make them for everyone else. And yeah, like Clara, we also struggled. I also struggled to make masks myself. And I think the trajectory of that is similar to what happened with a lot of people, because the supplies were in such, it was really difficult to get elastic. So we used Velcro. My husband still likes these Velcro masks. I think they're terrible, but you could see sort of the development, not just in terms of how people got around a shortage of supplies, but also how the masks themselves evolved. You know, they really started with people just wearing bandanas, and they've become more and more complex over time, even those made by these sewing groups. It's been really interesting to watch that evolution.
Now we have a fascinating question from our audience. Clearly they're really listening closely to what you say, and we're intrigued by that banter back and forth about the masks being somewhat old-fashioned, and the rise of antibiotics made the masks seem unnecessary. And so they've sort of pitched that forward, and they want to know whether you think that the development of the polio vaccine killed the lady's white cotton glove, or was there a different? You know, was the fashion changing anyway, or was the cotton glove part of the need to keep a clean environment?
I think I would not make that leap. I mean, it is true. I do have I remember one of my grad school professors did post something about that she remembers that she was a child in the 50s, and that wearing gloves was kind of seen as a cleanliness thing. But gloves kind of falling out of fashion, which was, I think, more in the 60s. I mean, there were so many cultural shifts that were going on in the 1960s. I wouldn't make the direct connection between the polio vaccine and gloves, but I do think there was a sense of sort of cleanliness of wearing gloves, and that being kind of a proper thing. But I mean, gloves and hats, there was a lot of sort of fashion things that got thrown out in the 60s that had to do a lot more with social upheaval, much more broadly than vaccine related.
So you did mention commercial production. So I'd like to look at this idea of relatively small production, moving away from people sewing individually at home or in groups at home, into small for sale production being marketed through different groups. Lexi, since some of these masks are actually yours, perhaps you can give us a start on the commonness of this small production.
Yeah, I mean, it's really quite interesting how Etsy and Redbubble, which also uses artists' images that they create to sell masks, those companies have really stepped up to sell masks on a large scale. What's interesting to me, and I think Clara can probably speak to this a little bit better than I can, but I find it fascinating how these masks allow you to express yourself. You know, in terms of sort of fashion, you can make a statement. These masks, as Peter said, these are actually all my masks. The top two are masks that I just found amusing, and my husband loves insects, so we got an insect mask for him for Christmas. I think that was also an interesting element too, that the idea that people are getting masks as stocking stuffers or things like that. That's kind of new and interesting. But what's, I think, fascinating about the small scale production is that business of you can make a statement, a fashion statement with that. And given that we've thrown away, hats and gloves and all sorts of elements of fashion, perhaps this is a new way that we can really indulge ourselves in making a fashion statement. But I'll defer to you, Clara, if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting to watch sort of the evolution of how people were talking about masks. And as it transitioned away from that sort of immediate PPP need to, oh, we might all be wearing this, all of these designers, big and small. And I thought it was interesting that I at least observed, and maybe it's just that I am reading comment sections that I shouldn't, but that there was a little backlash against some designers when they were first kind of making more fun, fashionable masks. First of this, I saw comments that were, how dare you profit off of this? I can't believe you're selling this. And I think, so that was a concern of, because a lot of these places have been donating masks to healthcare workers, but I think there's also this piece of it that sewing is seen as women's work. And there's, as a culture, women, cleaning and cooking and sewing are all things that we assume should be free labor. And so not, as opposed to thinking of that, this is, some of these places, I mean, they're employing people. This is keeping people employed to be sewing. But this idea that it's something that should be given away for free. So I noticed some designers getting a little backlash of, how dare you charge for this work? That kind of faded as I saw eventually, I think, as it became so important and people could see sort of the artistry. But two, I think there was a concern about whether sort of more fashionable masks was making light of the pandemic, or that it was something frivolous. And that's often a backlash that comes with fashion in general, because people think that fashion isn't something serious. So this is something functional. This isn't a laughing matter. This is a pandemic. But as Lexi was saying, that part of the thing about making more fun masks is trying to make a relatively grim situation that we're in, trying to make it more palatable. And that this idea of not trying to separate mask wearing from this very grim image of disease, and making it something fun, making it personal expression, making people looking forward to matching a mask with their outfit when they go out. And so I think it's been a great thing, because it is trying to turn it into something more enjoyable than this kind of, oh, we're doing this because we're in this horrible pandemic, and it's this association with disease and death.
The fun is definitely an interesting observation. I'm really glad you brought that up. But also thinking about the corporate side of it, we have branded masks. Here you can see Home Depot, Walt Disney World, Beauty Blender. How does branding figure into this whole story of mask wearing?
Well, I think it also ties into that there's a lot of companies walking kind of a tight line of perception during this time and wanting, I mean, first of all, a lot of places, donating the first mask they were making to healthcare workers, and companies wanting to make sure that they're being perceived to be doing the right thing. So then making sure that their employees are supplied with masks, making sure if they're selling masks, that I think branding, same thing with fashion. There was some people who were making masks out of things that had logos on that, so you could have like a Gucci mask or a Burberry mask. Usually that was an individual making it, not companies doing that. There was still, especially the high fashion brands, there was kind of resistance to the idea of making it this kind of elite type thing. But with other kinds of companies, I think it was important they wanted to be seen as doing their part and of being part of the effort to flatten the curve. So having these branded masks was also part of their making sure that they're doing the right thing, because there's a lot of public backlash if it felt like a company was not taking it seriously.
Well, here's an interesting question from our audience. I guess it's a Sears and Roebuck basic ad question. Would masks for sale have shown up in catalogs during the early 20th century? Did Sears and Roebuck or Montgomery Ward's actually sell masks?
I've not seen any evidence. That doesn't mean that they didn't, but I have not seen evidence that they were selling masks during the period. I'm not sure if Clara or Michelle, but I've never seen evidence of that.
I haven't either, and I wonder if some of that would have been just because of the turnaround time of those catalogs that were printed. So were so much, the interval was so long, and that the epidemic was not that long, that it just didn't get turned around fast enough, but I don't know.
That totally makes sense. I'd like to move on to our last section, personal statement. We've had a number of people asking questions about this. I've been sort of holding back on, but the mask as personal statement. I know that many people have maybe not as bad as a shoe closet, but if you have dozens of masks, you really have to put them somewhere in order to accessorize properly. We'd like to take another poll here about where you have acquired your masks. So if you can, shortly we'll have the pop-up that will let you vote, and you can choose as many as you want. That have you bought from local businesses? Have you purchased from national retailers, independent sellers? Have you made them? A family member or a friend, or possibly your company gave you masks? So a lot of different choices there. You can see that the votes are flying in. Looks strong. Why people are voting? Michelle, what's your personal story on mask acquisition?
So I am fortunate that I have some very crafty friends and have been gifted a number of masks, including one with Little House on the Prairie fabric, actually, and some other that are calico inspired. So people who know me well have generously donated masks directly to me, which has been great.
Excellent. So we'll end the polling and we can share the results. You can see that 41% of you have been buying from a small local business. That's really great. 45% from the big dealers, 29% through small groups like Etsy, Spoonful, or Redbubble. That actually surprises me. I was sort of predicting in my mind it would be larger. Only 23% of folks have made them. Half of you got them from families and friends, and 29% have corporate masks that were given to them by their group. So that's great. Thank you all for voting, and we'll now go on to see some self-expression and politics. Clara, these two masks on the left come from your collections. Can you tell us a little bit about how people are expressing themselves?
Yeah, we purchased two masks from local Black designers in Seattle. And because, I mean, obviously this last year, in addition to the pandemic, we had this big movement of protests and national reckoning with racism. And so a local designer that we had worked with before actually is also a milliner, and we have a hat from her in our collection, Sonia Wittengill. I noticed on her Instagram that she was making masks and also making use of her embroidery machine and making all kinds of slogans on the mask. But of course, I Can't Breathe being a very important slogan this year. It was used first in 2014 for the Black Lives Matter movement because it was spoken by Eric Garner when he was murdered, and then became resonant again in 2020 with George Floyd. And then we also acquired this more celebratory mask from the designer is Ashanti Martin Smith, and her line is called Ashanti Monique Customs. And she sewed this mask and hand painted it. And she had a few different masks that she had hand painted, celebrating Juneteenth, which is a celebration of the end of slavery. And we did have celebrations in Seattle. They were outdoors. It was socially distant, but it was still important to celebrate that holiday even when masked. So we thought these were important representations of this other huge piece of the 2020 story.
So Michelle, I keep thinking back to that awesome scrapbook page that you have, and how you told us that the mask was sort of daily life of college education. And I'm wondering, do you think that that scrapbooks from college students today are going to have a mask glued in? And if so, will they be personalized in some kind of way?
That's a really interesting question. We're at the Bentley, we're actually doing a collecting initiative, as many other institutions are, of course. But so much of what students are generating is digital, and we don't generally take artifacts. We're an archive, not a museum. But when what they're doing is uploading, where would you put the mask? So I think that the part of the reason that scrapbook for us today is so popular among researchers is that tangible quality, that it's right there. I mean, we've even had observers wonder, like, do you think there's any virus still alive on that? Like, could the virus have survived? So there's something about that. It's tangibility that I'm not sure how we as an archive are going to necessarily capture that now. I mean, museums maybe, but it certainly is a big part of it. Although, maybe the iconic artifact for us on a university campus of this is going to be the fact that to go onto campus, you have to do like a self-test that to say that you don't have these various symptoms, and then you get a big check mark, and it's called responsive blue. Maize and blue are our colors, and you have to show that as a QR code, or potentially be able to show that. That might be the artifact that comes out of this today, although masks are required on campus right now as well.
Lexi, you've been leading the Smithsonian's COVID-19 collecting drive. Are you seeing a lot of personal identity in terms of these masks?
Yes, I think these are extraordinarily personal. We're seeing a lot that have political statements. We're seeing a lot that are really just fashion statements. And then we're also receiving a fair number of masks, which might look ordinary, but people tell a story about it, which helps us to see it in a more personal light. So yeah, I think of all the objects that ordinary folks, by which I mean those of us who are not medical practitioners, when we think of the pandemic, I think the mask is the thing that we will think of. I also think what's interesting is because of social media and people documenting their lives today, I think that many of us will hang on to our masks in ways that people from 1918, 1919 might not have done so. I think people are much more conscious of this idea that we're living in a moment of history, and just that whole habit of documenting your life. We don't do it in scrapbooks in the same way that people did in the early 20th century, but we do it on I would say on a larger scale, because people are doing it digitally. And that may lead people to keep their mask.
That's fascinating. Well, I know a lot of you've been talking about fashion. So here we have some fashion selections. Clara put many of these together. Clara, can you tell us from a fashion perspective whether masks are an accessory or a nuisance?
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think having them be more fashionable is a way to make it more fun and to make it more palatable to wear masks. So some of the ones that are on the screen, Luli Young is a local couture designer, but she also designs the uniforms for Alaska Airlines. So she has a very sort of fashion function kind of business. And so she's selling both what she's calling atelier face masks that are using high-end fabrics that she has for her couture collection, Swarovski crystals. So that's on the left hand is one of those masks. But then she also sells everyday masks that are made to be kind of comfortable, and they have the layers, but still with her signature butterfly patterns. And then Gustavo Apati, who's also a sort of custom and couture designer, I thought he was interesting because his masks, he has a range of styles that he's making, but some of them are more on the masculine side. And we haven't really talked about the gender divide. There's been a lot of studies that men are more resistant to wear masks than women, and that a lot of women are more interested in the sort of fashionable side. So I thought it was interesting that he was definitely trying to make very fashionable menswear masks to make that sort of interesting and kind of strong, and that as opposed to men who may be more resistant to wearing like a floral mask, something that's going to be more kind of masculine in its presentation. And then Nancy Pelosi has been matching masks, and she's been purchasing them from a local boutique in the DC area that she's shopped at before. And then on the slide also that the mask wearing in Japan and other parts of Asia has been common for a while, and that also as a fashion statement has been part of it, that there are more fun masks, more masks that are kind of part of a look.
Yeah, if you notice this photograph from Japan is 2007. So this is long before the coronavirus concerns. Why did something happen in Japan that made people specifically tuned into masks? Maybe Michelle or Lexi, you could give us some insight on this.
Sure. I mean, at this period is when you have like the emergence of SARS, which is also a coronavirus as well. And so there were concerns about that. And that would have been a part of it. But as Clara said, there was also a longer and stronger tradition of wearing masks and mask wearing in Asia. And so that's also a part of this as well. It's hard to know is the specific reason why these individuals are wearing a mask, but it's probably tied to either of those two factors.
Well, our last topic that we want to look at is really the ceremonial use of masks. Instead of masks more as a one-off situation that for weddings, for communions, for graduation. Is this a common occurrence? Is this creeping into everyday life, or is the ceremonial use the exception rather than the rule?
So it's actually
Clara, you probably have the most insight here.
Well, I think Lexi, you wanted to say something.
I was going to say what's interesting is that, when we think of ceremony and ritual in our lives, these are usually things that involve multiple people, large groups of people. And we're obviously forbidden now to be around large groups of people. So there's this contradictory aspect when we see these ceremonial masks for something like a first communion, in which you normally would invite a lot of people to attend it, but now you can't. So it's just a fascinating contradiction. And you can see how the ritual itself may be changing. It's now on Zoom.
Yeah, and I think as far as collecting for museums, it's an acknowledgement that while in some ways it feels like our lives kind of stopped over this last year, that there's a lot of things that kind of ground to a halt, our lives did go on, and that people graduated from high school, people had their first communion, there were still, this woman is still a pageant winner, and I don't have photos of them yet, but we got some masks from a local hospital that for parents that say it's a boy and it's a girl. So people are having kids, people are going through major life milestones and triumphs too. And so it's an acknowledgement, I think, as far as historians, that as we look back, of reminding people that, we were still living our lives. We found it in different ways, but that there were still rites of passage happening.
That's great. Well, we're really at our closing time, and I want to end with sort of 3 quick slides that ask the question of how long will this continue? Here we have our panelists. This is their everyday life. It's sort of difficult to recognize who's who. Do you think that people will continue to wear masks once they've been vaccinated? What's the arc? Has the mask become part of everyday life? Here you can see the panelists. We can pull out a little bit and see folks in more common occurrences. What is this? What kind of class is this, Lexi? In the upper left.
So this is a taekwondo class in Brooklands in Washington, D.C.
And then we can zoom out even further, and it's sort of every walk of life, every type of action has this. Do you all think this is with us for a while, or are people going to lose their masks soon?
I think it may go on for a while. I mean, it used to be that people thought nothing of drinking out of the same cup, right? Like on a train or in other public circumstances, you would take a cup and the next person would take a drink. I'm wondering whether the handshake may go the way of that, drinking from a common cup. But just as, you know, a person walking around, there are other illnesses out there that the common cold, for example, that, you know, maybe this is a good idea just in general that we have learned. Why not take an extra step to kind of protect our health in this way? And I think masks seem to go from a symbol that everything had shut down, as we saw in some of those rituals, to a tool to come as close to regular life as possible. And I expect they're going to stay that. It's not going to be an abrupt end for sure. My historians don't like to predict, but it will sort of taper off in a slower pace than we might expect, would be my, you know, prediction, I guess.
Yeah, I would sort of agree with Michelle. And I
Well,
think
Michelle, we'll give you the. Go ahead, Lexi.
I was going to say, I'd agree with Michelle. I think not just the handshake, but I think the thing that Americans really started doing, maybe I would say over the last 40 years, which is often embracing when we meet. I think that may change too. And like Michelle, I think it will taper off. And also, I just think that you'll see it frequently in public places with confined spaces, like public transportation, or if you're going maybe even to a concert and you're pressed up close against people. I could see people wearing a mask, continuing to do so. Although, as Michelle said, it's impossible for historians to predict. We're not very good at it.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Michelle, Lexi, and Clara. You've really been wonderfully insightful. I hope that members of the public will join us in 2 weeks on February 2nd for a really fascinating talk on race and place, looking at yellow fever in the Free American Society in Philadelphia. So that will be our next session of the pandemic perspectives. So thank you all for coming. And I really, I'm very grateful to our panelists for their insights and contributions. Thank you.